Dear student, I am Dr. Prakash Mungli, Professor of Biochemistry. So in this series of special products coming from amino acids, so I will be going over melanin, thyroid hormones and tyramine. Now let's get into details on melanin. Melanin is a skin pigment which is synthesized in the melanocytes of our skin. And the amino acid tyrosine is the one that is converted to melanin. So as it is shown here in the figure below, tyrosine is converted to DOPA initially by tyrosine hydroxylase enzyme, which is called as tyrosinase. So tyrosinase here is a tyrosine hydroxylase, but it is a different type of tyrosine hydroxylase than the one that we have seen in the conversion of tyrosine into catecholamine, which needs tetrahydrobiopterin. That tyrosinase is different than the tyrosinase that you are going to see here in the melanocytes. So that is why, just to differentiate, the tyrosine hydroxylase that is involved in catecholamine synthesis, like dopamine, norepinephrine and epinephrine, that is referred as tyrosine hydroxylase, whereas the tyrosine hydroxylase that you see here in the melanocyte, which doesn't need tetrahydrobiopterin, in fact, but it needs this enzyme, it needs copper as the cofactor. And just to differentiate with the other enzyme, this tyrosine hydroxylase is simply referred as tyrosinase. So otherwise what it does, tyrosine is hydroxylated to make dihydroxyphenylalanine, and that further is converted into DOPAquinone. So conversion of tyrosine into DOPA to DOPAquinone, it is catalyzed by the same enzyme, that is tyrosinase, and this tyrosinase is a copper dependent enzyme expressed in the melanocytes, and the expression of this copper dependent tyrosinase is increased whenever a person is exposed to sunlight, specifically the ultraviolet component of the sunlight. Okay, what happens to DOPAquinone? DOPAquinone will be further converted into pheomelanins and eumelanins, and in that eumelanins are the true melanins, which are kind of brown to black in color. Okay, so that's why the amount of melanin pigment in our tissues, especially that is seen in the skin, hair, choroidal plexus, substantia nigra, in the retina, and also in the ciliary body of the eye. So the pigmentation of these tissues depending on the concentration of melanin that is made in these tissues. So the amount of melanin will lead to pigmentation accordingly. Even the changes in the pigmentation between individuals, it also depends on the amount of melanin that is made in the skin by melanocytes, and that is genetically mediated. The activity of tyrosinase enzyme is genetically mediated, and also it is modulated, its activity modulated depending on the amount of exposure to sunlight. Higher exposure to sunlight will increase the tanning process, means pigmentation increases, which is called as tanning. So living indoors may decrease that pigmentation, so that kind of variation can be seen. Otherwise, tyrosinase enzyme expression is more of a genetically mediated thing. That's why we see individuals with different skin pigmentation. So higher the melanin pigment, remember, it protects our skin from ultraviolet light. Now, here are the functions of melanin. So one of the important function of melanin is it protects our skin from ultraviolet light and prevent DNA damage, thereby future skin cancers. So melanin prevents sunburn and skin cancer. That's why a person who is fair, having less melanin, they are more prone for sunburn, and also the incidence of skin cancer in them, if they are exposed to sunlight repeatedly, so that will be higher. And also melanin, it absorbs stray light in the retina, that's why melanin is present in the retina, and also it increases visual acuity and prevents photophobia. That's why people who have less melanin or low melanin or no melanin, like what is seen in a disease called albinism, so they will have photophobia and also they will have decrease in the visual acuity, and also those people are susceptible for sunburn and skin cancers are seen at higher frequency in those people. So let's move on to see more details on albinism, which is a disease related with conversion of tyrosine into melanin. So the enzyme involved there is tyrosinase. So any defect in the tyrosinase enzyme may lead to albinism, a genetic defect, or any proteins that are associated with the conversion of tyrosine into melanin. If there is any defect in those proteins, that can also lead to albinism. So the frequency of albinism is 1 in 20,000. So that means it is relatively more common. And oculocutaneous albinism, it involves eyes, skin and hair. That's what is the oculocutaneous albinism. And the oculocutaneous albinism, furthermore, there are 7 forms of oculocutaneous albinism, which can be divided into OCA, that is oculocutaneous albinism, from 1 to 7. So out of these 1 to 7 oculocutaneous albinism, oculocutaneous albinism A1, which is a tyrosine related albinism, it results from a genetic defect in the enzyme called tyrosinase. Majority of the time, this is the one that is commonly given in the books and commonly tested, but that doesn't mean that other details are not tested. So tyrosinase enzyme, which is involved in the conversion of tyrosine into DOPA, further DOPA going into melanin formation. So defect in tyrosinase enzyme will give rise to OCA1 or oculocutaneous albinism type 1. Now, there are 2 subtypes of oculocutaneous albinism type 1, that is oculocutaneous albinism type 1A and oculocutaneous albinism type 1B. Now in type 1A, tyrosinase is negative, that means no tyrosinase activity is seen. That means no melanin is produced. That means it leads to a complete perfect albinism. That means no useful melanin is made here. And the hair is white, skin is very light, means fair. So that's a perfect albinism. Whereas 1B is tyrosinase positive, that means small amount of melanin is produced. Hair that may be darkened to blonde, yellow, orange or even light brown, as well as slightly more pigment in the skin can be seen. This type of albinism is referred as complete imperfect albinism. So that is OCA1, it has 1A and 1B. 1A is complete perfect albinism and 1B is complete imperfect albinism. So the albinos, patients with albinism are abnormally sensitive to sunlight. Even a slight exposure to sunlight causes sunburns, and that can lead to DNA damage and eventually place these people at high risk of skin cancer. And photophobia is one of the common feature of albinism. Coming to thyroid hormones, which are derivatives of amino acid tyrosine. So iodinated tyrosine derivatives, that is T3, which is referred as triiodothyronine, and T4, which is referred as tetraiodothyronine, are the derivatives of tyrosine. And these thyroid hormones, they are synthesized from iodine, and which are added on to tyrosyl residues present over thyroglobulin. Basically, it is the iodination of tyrosine amino acids in a thyroglobulin molecule. So out of 134 tyrosine residues, up to 25 to 30 of the tyrosine side chains are iodinated in a thyroglobulin, as it is shown here. And this iodination process, iodination of tyrosine residue, is promoted by thyroid stimulating hormone in that colloidal thyroglobulin structure in the thyroid follicle, and then that thyroglobulin releases the iodinated tyrosine molecules as triiodothyronine or tetraiodothyronine. Let's see how that happens. So if two iodine molecules are added, that becomes diiodotyrosine. If only one iodine molecule is added, it is monoiodotyrosine. If one diiodotyrosine combined with another monoiodotyrosine, so you get a triiodotyrosine. So that is around 10% of the total thyroid hormone. If two diiodotyrosines are there combining, it becomes thyroxine, that is 90% of thyroid hormones that is there in the circulation. That's how the thyroid hormones are synthesized. Coming to tyramine, which is a deaminated form of tyrosine and the cheese effect. Tyrosine decarboxylase enzyme converts tyrosine into tyramine, and the tyramine content in the food will increase whenever a food is stored for a long time, or whenever food is fermented or kept for decay process for a long time, because this continuously there will be conversion of tyrosine that is present in that food, especially if the food has higher protein content. Continuously the tyrosine will be converted to tyramine. So in our body, if the tyrosine is converted to tyramine, so an enzyme called monoamino oxidase will take care of that and it's going to degrade tyramine. But if too much amount of tyramine is coming by consumption of food like pickled, aged, fermented, marinated meat, pork, fish, cheese, wine, which all contains high levels of tyramine, when such food is consumed in a large quantities, at that time monoamino oxidase enzyme, which oxidizes and degrades tyramine, will be functioning at higher level. The problem occurs whenever a patient who is placed on monoamino oxidase inhibitors. In a normal individual, there won't be any issue, because a normal individual will have a monoamino oxidase enzyme functioning and it will take care of degradation of tyramine. Whereas in a person who is on monoamino oxidase inhibitors, usually for like treatment of depression, so if that person consumes anything that is pickled, salted, aged, fermented, or consumes like cheese, wine, which all contains high amount of tyramine, if that kind of food is consumed, so the tyramine getting into that person's body will be higher, and that tyramine has to be degraded into its degradation product and excreted. That should be done by monoamino oxidase enzyme. But the patients are these people who are on monoamino oxidase inhibitors, they won't be able to degrade tyramine. So tyramine levels in them will increase, and that will give rise to a cheese effect. Why this is called as a cheese effect? Because the signs and symptoms and the metabolic events that I am going to explain now is seen in patients who are on monoamino oxidase inhibitors, and if they eat cheese which contains high levels of tyramine, or if they drink wine, or if they eat anything that is pickled or aged or fermented or marinated like meat, pork or fish, all of these, if they take it, that causes a cheese effect. So only cheese is used here in naming the condition, other things are not used. So that's why it is just referred as cheese effect. So what happens in cheese effect? High tyramine, what it does is, it is going to release, and this norepinephrine, it causes sympathomimetic effects, and the sympathomimetic effects are vasoconstriction, increase in heart rate, increase in blood pressure, and sometimes it can lead to cardiac arrest. And these effects, we refer it as a cheese effect. And the cheese effect, note that it is because of increased amount of tyramine in the body, and this tyramine will lead to increased release of norepinephrine. This is commonly seen in people who are on monoamino oxidase inhibitors, and on top of it, if they consume any food that has high levels of tyramine. So that's about some of the special products coming from amino acids. So I have covered melanin, thyroid hormones and tyramine. Thank you.